Hello and welcome to this informational session on the licensing and practice of social work in New York State, sponsored by the New York State Association of Deans of Schools of Social Work and the New York State chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. I'm your host, Celicia Street, Communications and Professional Development Associate for the New York State chapter of NASW. Joining me today is David Hamilton, Executive Secretary to the State's Board for Social Work in the New York State Education Department. Also joining us is Karen Moran, Director of Policy for the NASW New York State Chapter. We will be providing a comprehensive overview of the regulations related to licensure as a licensed master social worker and a licensed clinical social worker, including recent changes that were enacted in 2010. David, can you provide us with a little background on the regulation of professional practice by the New York State Education Department?
Sure, thank you, Celicia. The education law establishes the requirements for licensure in 48 professions. These include health professions as well as design and business professions. The law includes the requirements for licensure as well as the definition of the scope of practice of the profession. It establishes and restricts titles for each of the professions, and it also defines unprofessional conduct, things that are prohibited under the law and for which a licensee may be sanctioned by the Board of Regents if they engage in misconduct.
Okay. Can you explain to us why there are two social work licenses?
In 2002, the legislature and the governor enacted a change to the law to create the licensed master social worker and the licensed clinical social worker. The licensed master social worker, or the LMSW, is the entry-level license, the one that's required when people get out of school to practice in community organizing, management, planning, those types of functions, but also to be able to complete supervised experience toward licensure as a licensed clinical social worker. The LCSW is the clinical license, which is the one typically held by an individual who's going to provide psychotherapy and related mental health services. While the practice is restricted, the law does provide some exemptions, and these exemptions, for instance, allow a student who's part of a licensed qualifying program to get experience as part of their internship before they receive their social work degree. The law also requires that people be licensed to practice, while there are other exemptions, such as people who work in certain facilities or programs organized, operated, funded, regulated, or approved by state agencies like the Office of Mental Health, the Office of Substance Abuse Services, the Department of Health. Generally, an individual has to be licensed in order to use a professional title and to engage in those activities that are restricted under the law.
Okay. And Karen, can you explain in some general terms what it means to engage in licensed social work practice?
Absolutely. Beginning with the fact that you must now, since 2004, register to practice the profession. The license is valid for life unless revoked, annulled, or suspended by the Board of Regents. But you must also bear in mind that you have to practice within your scope of practice in a legal setting or entity, comply with laws, rules, and regulations, and understand that unprofessional or criminal actions may result in professional discipline.
Okay. And David, what are the laws that guide social work practice?
Well, since 2004, the laws, as we've said, define what a licensed master social worker or a licensed clinical social worker can do, the tasks that they perform. That's part of the education law. But there are other provisions of law that relate to the practice of the professions. The insurance law establishes reimbursement by third parties for psychotherapy and certain privileges. Or the public health law establishes the requirements for a licensed social worker to maintain records, provide patients with access to the records. The civil procedures or civil practices law sets out privileged communication so that when a licensed social worker communicates with their client, there's a reasonable expectation that that information would be kept as confidential unless that's waived by the client or unless certain other conditions are met. And then finally, there's the commissioner's regulations. The regulations, if the law provides the skeleton, the regulations sort of provide the meat and the flesh to clarify what's intended by the law. So if the law said you have to have a master's degree, the regulations might specify what the content is in that master's degree. So all of those things together become relevant and important for the licensing and for the practice of the profession.
Okay. Now let's get into the details of the requirements for licensure. Karen, can we start with the review of the requirements for the LMSW?
Yes, the requirements for the LMSW are pretty straightforward, actually. You know, obviously you have to earn a degree from a program that's registered with the New York State Education Department as qualifying for the LMSW or the LCSW. File an application and submit a fee, be at least 21 years of age and of good moral character, and complete pass the ASWB's master's examination and complete an approved 2-hour course on the identification and reporting of child abuse and maltreatment. Worthy of note, though, is since 2005, social work curriculums in New York State have encompassed this within their curriculum. However, should you have graduated prior to 2005 and not have the applicable course, you can access it on NASW's website and other approved programs from the State Education Department.
Okay. Now, let's say I'm a new graduate and I've been offered a clinical job at the place where I did my field placement, but I haven't had a chance to, I just graduated, I haven't had a chance to take my master's exam to get my LMSW. What can I do? Can I take this job?
Well, yes, while you were provided an exemption to practice in the field and provide clinical social work services as a student, be aware of the fact that once you graduate, that exemption no longer applies. However, there is a mechanism to take such a job and have a limited permit. You would apply for the limited permit through the State Education Department's website.
Okay. And what are the parameters of practice for the limited permit?
Well, once the permit is issued, the permit holder can engage in the practice of LMSW or LCSW. However, they must be supervised by an LMSW or LCSW.
Okay. When should a permit applicant apply for their LMSW?
What we typically recommend is that you can apply for licensure at any time. You have to apply for licensure before you need it. So we typically recommend that a student would apply during their last semester of graduate school. They can get the application and the money in with us. Then as soon as they graduate, the registrar of their program would submit verification that they completed the education required so that they can search for a job, say that they are eligible for a permit. So when they find an acceptable job under the supervision of an LMSW or an LCSW, they can submit the permit application, and that can be processed typically within a week or two so that they can start the job and start providing services to clients while they're preparing to take the examination.
Okay, excellent. We receive a lot of questions about what happens if a permit holder doesn't pass the exam within the 1-year permit period. Is it renewable? Can it be extended?
The law sets out the limited permit, which is really like a temporary license, so that you can practice under supervision. When the legislature set the provisions for these types of permits, they want to make sure that people who are under supervision and who are not licensed have the minimum time they need to be able to pass the exam, but not forever, so that there are time limits. In this profession, the permit's only valid for a year. It cannot be extended, it cannot be renewed. But in the course of that year, an individual could try the exam, could take 3 tries on the examination if they needed to. If they don't pass the first time, they need to wait 90 days to take it again. The waiting period is not a punishment, but it's an opportunity for them to go back, look at what they've done, how they performed on that examination, and study more and prepare better for the next examination so that they'll be able to pass that.
Okay. Okay, David, let's go through the requirements for the LCSW.
The LCSW is based on an individual who is going to want to practice psychotherapy, engage in diagnosis, and provide those types of clinical services. To become an LCSW, an individual first needs to be licensed as an LMSW in New York. That's how they legally get experience. Anytime during the 3 years or more that they're working to get their experience, they can submit their application for the LCSW. They can have their graduate school submit their verification of their education so we can determine if they had the content required under the law for the clinical license. And then as they complete the experience, their supervisor submits documentation that they've completed hours. They need at least 36 months and 2,000 client contact hours in diagnosis, in psychotherapy, and assessment-based treatment planning under a qualified supervisor. And When that is approved then by the board, then we will make them eligible for the exam. So while they're still in LMSW, still practicing under supervision, they've met the experience and the education requirements, they can take the clinical exam then. And when they get that license, they will then have actually 2 licenses, one for the LMSW and one for the LCSW.
Okay. Now, Karen, given the 2 licenses, are there actions that should be taken as a social work student to prepare for social work licensure?
Well, there are definitely decisions to be made early on in your social work career as a student, and that being, do you want to pursue a clinical track or more of a management advocacy track? If you hope to provide services as a clinical social worker, you need to be cognizant of the fact that there are 12 semester hours that are focused specifically on clinical core content that must be completed at the master's level prior to graduation and prior to applying for your LCSW. So every once in a while we'll get a call from somebody who's gone to school years ago, they were on the macro track and they don't have the clinical core content. And the answer to the question is, do I have to go back and get it, is yes. You must complete those 12 semester hours of clinical core content, become an LCSW.
Okay. David, can you follow up on, let's add a little bit to that statement for folks who have already graduated and may not have that clinical content. How, can they still be licensed? How do they go about that?
The law and our regulations allow an individual who's got an MSW degree to apply for the license. As Karen said, if we find that their clinical content is missing, we'll notify them of that, and then they can go back, and most every school of social work in New York State will consider admitting them as a non-matriculated student. So they can complete the specific coursework that they need. So they don't need to get a new degree, they just need to get the additional graduate coursework from the degree granting program that we then combine with their basic or first MSW degree, so they meet the content requirements.
Okay. And what about their clinical experience? Does that have to be completed after they've already done this clinical coursework, if they need to go back and do that?
Well, the law allows an LMSW to engage in clinical practice under supervision. So they very well could have engaged in several years of clinical practice under a qualified supervisor. It could be a question, though, for the individual, if they never took a course in psychopathology and previously provided services. Now they've taken that course, they might have a different understanding of psychopathology as it relates to the practice of social work, and they might want to wait and get more experience after completing that additional coursework. But that's something we leave up to them and to their supervisor.
Okay. All right. Now, Karen, what exactly is in the scope of practice for the LMSW?
Well, once you're an LMSW, you will first receive your license parchment and registration certificate, and you can practice as an LMSW without further licensure and provide the services within that scope of the LMSW, which include case management, community organizing, advocacy, planning and administration, and supportive counseling. And as David just mentioned, an LMSW can provide clinical services as well, such as psychotherapy. However, they must do it under the supervision, under appropriate supervision.
And in an authorized setting.
And in an authorized setting, absolutely.
Okay. And David, can you review the scope of practice for the LCSW?
Well, the scope of practice for the LCSW starts with the LMSW, and it encompasses everything that an LMSW can do, because those are all critical parts of social work practice as well. But then it also adds the development and implementation of appropriate assessment-based treatment plans based on the social worker's assessment of the client and the determination of services that are needed, provision of psychotherapy, both short-term and long-term, that could include psychoanalysis or other modalities, again, based on the training and the competence of the clinical social worker. And all of these activities, as well as the diagnosis of mental illness, other conditions using the DSM, they're all related to the practice of social work and addressing what is defined as clinical social work practice in New York, so that the individual is providing psychotherapy as is recognized under the law, and they've met standards for specialized training in that area beyond what they had just for their MSW, for general LMSW practice.
Okay. Now, Karen, since the LMSW can only practice clinical social work under appropriate supervision, can you outline the criteria of what constitutes appropriate clinical supervision?
Sure. Appropriate supervision, clinical supervision, must be performed first and foremost by an LCSW, a licensed psychologist, or a psychiatrist. The amount of supervision is an aggregation of 100 hours over the 2,000 hours of clinical experience. But two very noteworthy things here, Celicia, that the supervisor is legally responsible for each of the cases of the supervisee, and they're also responsible to maintain the appropriate records of such cases.
Okay. And David, what happens if a social worker works in an agency that doesn't have an appropriate clinical supervisor in-house? Can they contract out for supervision?
Well, the first question to be asked is, if the agency does not have a qualified supervisor, is the agency really ready to be providing psychotherapy in those services? So that might be something that the agency needs to look at first, as well as the social worker who's considering that setting. The second thing is, if they don't have a qualified supervisor on site, the agency can contract with a licensed clinical social worker, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist to provide that supervision. As Karen said, that supervisor is responsible for each one of the clients that's seen and for the activities of the LMSW who's practicing under supervision. So clients need to know that the supervisor is responsible for that patient. The agency needs to know that an outside party is responsible for directing the care of those patients. If a social worker were to make those type of arrangements on his or herself, by himself or herself, without telling the client, without telling the agency, it raises a lot of liability questions for the agency and for the professionals who are involved, as well as the patient, who should know who is really directing the services and to make sure that they are the appropriate services.
And the clinical supervisor would need to have access to, clinical client information, and so there's confidentiality, and clients would need to give
their consent for that, exactly.
Okay, all right. And now let's touch base on the issue of authorized practice settings. David, can you explain what this is?
Well, the law, since the LMSW and the LCSW are both independently licensed, the law would allow me as an LMSW to set up a practice to provide services within the LMSW scope. So I could set up a practice doing community organizing, policy, management, administration type of consulting. I could not do clinical social work, though, in my own private practice because I'm not authorized to practice that. Even though I can do that under supervision, I'm not authorized, so I still can't have a practice to provide that. I could be employed, though, if I wanted to get clinical experience, by a licensed clinical social worker or licensed psychologist or licensed psychiatrist who would be responsible for the patients and assigning me work and supervising my professional development. I could be employed by a professional corporation set up by someone in one of those professions where they've got a qualified supervisor on board. And there's various types of professional corporations that individuals can set up. I could be in a facility that's approved by the Office of Mental Health or the Department of Health, the Office of Children and Family Services, where clinical services are provided to individuals, families, groups, and the LCSW would be getting an appropriate supervision. One of the issues that we found since we started implementing this law is that there are many community-based organizations and not-for-profits that, before there was a licensing law, employed social workers and others to provide psychotherapy and services that really were not within their authority, that once we implemented a licensing law, only licensed persons could provide those services. So that created a little crunch in the need for additional legislation to try and address those problems of what we call the corporate practice of a profession, which is prohibited, whether the business is a for-profit or a not-for-profit.
Okay. Karen, can you, how can someone determine whether they're in an authorized setting or practicing in a legal setting?
Well, the State Education Department actually has developed a prospective review mechanism. Beginning in 2010, LMSW can submit Form 6, which they can also find on the State Education Department's website, basically to determine if the experience completed there would be appropriate for licensure as an LCSW, as opposed to getting all the way to the end and putting their application in and hoping for the best. If the state board has questions, if questions pop up regarding the application related to the setting and whether or not it should be authorized or not, the LMSW will be notified of such questions and they will be asked to provide further clarification. It's a relatively easy process.
Okay. All right. Another question that we get is whether experience completed under a limited permit is acceptable.
An individual who's got a limited permit to practice licensed master social work can practice the profession under supervision. So if they've got a limited permit and the supervisor is qualified, that is, they're an LCSW and the individual's providing psychotherapy, then that would be acceptable experience just as if they completed it if they were licensed as an LMSW under a qualified supervisor.
Okay, great. Now we're going to address some of the frequently asked questions received by NASW and the Social Work Board. One of the most frequently asked questions is, can an LMSW own and operate a private practice and hire a supervisor, a clinical supervisor?
This is another one of those situations that has changed over the years based on the fact that social work was title protected only and the scope was not defined or restricted before 2004. So that prior to that date, any individual could go out and open a business and provide psychotherapy, including a social worker. When the law changed and established scopes of practice, an LMSW can practice that profession independently in their own practice, and that but they cannot provide clinical social work because they can only do that under supervision. They cannot employ a supervisor or anyone else who reviews their cases with them. They'd have to be in a setting owned by an LCSW and employed by the LCSW, or working for another qualified individual or an organization. Okay. Now, we knew that this went on before the law took effect, and because it's so difficult to reach out to more than 20,000 licensed master social workers who were out there practicing, some people didn't get the word. So we found when we were reviewing applications that we needed to address that problem. At my recommendation, the Committee on the Professions within the department authorized us to allow an individual who had set up a private practice as an LMSW to provide clinical services, or who had employed their supervisor when they worked in another setting. If they started that before February of 2009, we're allowing them to continue that to completion, which would be February 2015, 6 years at the most. We're not allowing new people who come out of school to set up this because that's not the way the law is intended, and that's not the way the legislature wants to ensure that people who are providing psychotherapy services are independently licensed and authorized to practice that profession.
Okay, so no LMSWs that should be engaging in their own private practice after February 2009. Okay, great. Now, as we mentioned earlier, an MSW who does not pass the examination can provide certain services, but not clinical social work services. Can you tell us more about what kind of tasks they can do without licensure?
The education law provides for an exemption for a person with a bachelor's of social work degree, which is the entry into the profession, and a person to be able to provide certain services that are defined under law as within the practice of licensed master social work. NASW and others came to us over recent years and said, well, what about someone who does not pass the exam and has got their MSW degree? Can they essentially function as a BSW? We looked at that with our attorneys, and the determination was yes, that made sense. So in 2010, the regents amended the regulations to state that an individual with a BSW or an MSW degree can engage in the administration, community organizing, the planning, the activities that are part of the licensed master scope of practice, just not the clinical social work or the supervision of clinical social work or any type of administrative supervision. And of course, they cannot use the title that's restricted under the law in 7702.
Okay. And are there any other exemptions under social work licensing?
Because social work licensing came along in 2002, when for decades organizations and individuals have been engaged in activities that would now be restricted, the legislature recognized that there was a need to try and allow unlicensed people to continue performing tasks that they were performing, even if those overlap with the scope of practice. So Section 7702 of the education law actually provides a list of activities that can be performed by a licensed master social worker, but that these activities in and of themselves do not require licensure. These could be administration, planning, running a community program. It could be research, evaluation about services that are provided. It could be community organizing, working to turn out the vote, engaged in activities that we typically consider as working with the community to empower that community. It can include things like helping people get access to services that they need, case management. So the case management, while it can be done by a social worker, and it can be part of social workers' practice, you don't have to be licensed to provide case management. So this makes the social work licensing law unique, not only among the professions here in New York, but also in terms of social work licensure across the country, defining activities that, while can be performed by a licensee, don't require licensure.
Okay. And what about other professionals who may be exempt from the law?
Well, there are provisions in the law to provide an exemption from licensure, which means an individual can engage in the activities that would be restricted, but they can't use the title. So for instance, there's exemptions for students who are in programs approved by the department as a BSW or an MSW program. There are exemptions for other professionals, individuals in nursing, medicine, mental health counseling, psychology, professions that overlap with the activities of licensed masters and licensed clinical social work. For individuals who are credentialed, for instance, as a KSAC, an alcoholism and substance abuse counselor, who works in a facility authorized to provide substance abuse services, but does not work outside and does not hold out to the public as being able to provide substance abuse or alcoholism services. So all of these exemptions allow people who are either other licenses or other credentials to provide those services. There's also general language that says an individual, a business, a not-for-profit, a church, a school, a teacher can engage in activities that might fall within the definition of social work, but as long as they're not using the title, they're not holding out as if they are licensed in any profession, they can provide those services. Again, the legislature tried not to disrupt what goes on in the communities while allowing people who do provide social work services to provide those appropriate services.
Okay. And Karen, many social workers are employed in agencies that are either operated by the state, such as an OMH facility, or issued an operating certificate by the state, such as hospitals, clinics, and residential programs. Can you discuss the exemption from licensure for these settings and what it means for individuals who may be seeking licensure as an LMSW or LCSW?
Yes, this has been actually one of the biggest issues and probably has received the most amount of attention from both our members and non-members alike. Prior to enactment of the social work licensure statute, a number of state agencies requested an exemption from the provisions of the licensing law, and that exemption was granted to the Office of Mental Health, the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services, the Office of Persons with Developmental Disabilities, local mental hygiene districts, and as well as local social service districts. That exemption, the original intention was that exemption would remain in place until January 1st of 2010. However, there were a few implementation issues still that needed to be worked out. So we've worked with the State Education Department and the legislature to provide for an additional extension to July 1 of 2013.
Okay. And I would add that one important note about this component of the exemptions is that the exemption applies to the setting and not the individual. So should an individual be practicing in an exempt setting without a license, if they were to go to another agency or another setting that was not exempt, they would have to be licensed if they were doing tasks within that scope of practice.
Correct. The exemption doesn't follow them.
Right. Okay. Just wanted to be clear on that. So what happens if a social worker gets their clinical experience in an exempt setting? Is that going to be acceptable, David, for licensing?
Well, the biggest issue that we have found is that an individual has to complete their experience legally, which the exempt setting could allow that to happen. They also, though, have to be under a qualified supervisor, and they have to be engaged in psychotherapy, diagnosis, and assessment-based treatment planning for 2,000 hours over 3 years with 100 hours of supervision. What we found is that in some of these exempt agencies, the individuals who were assigned to supervise might not meet the requirements in the education law for being an LCSW, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist. For instance, in a lot of substance abuse programs, there are people who have an MSW degree and a CASAC credential, which qualifies them to provide services in that program, but don't qualify as a supervisor under the licensing law. So the individual can think that they're getting the experience, but it's not going to be acceptable because we can't accept an unqualified supervisor. So what we have done is create what we call the Form 6, and it provides an individual, whether they're in an exempt setting or not, to submit that with their supervisor, with the copy of their supervisor's license, and with information about the setting so that we can look at that, and then we can come back to that applicant and say, or that LMSW, and say, this setting is approved, this supervisor is qualified, so this would be acceptable experience for you to complete. It's then up to the supervisor to make sure that the person meets those requirements. If there's a problem with the supervisor, if there's a problem with the setting, we also tell the individual so they can work for an alternative supervisor or for a position in a different setting where they can get the experience that they want to get licensed as a clinical social worker.
Okay, all right. Now, another issue that tends to come up, and something that's not widely understood, is that since one needs to be an LMSW to meet the experience requirements for the LCSW, and then they may, apply and get approved to be an LCSW, at that time they will technically have 2 licenses. So what should people do?
There are some individuals who might want to hold 2 licenses for one reason or another, but most people will not. So once an individual is licensed as an LCSW, they will receive at some point a renewal notice for their LMSW license. They can wait until they get that renewal notice, or anytime before that they can contact the Office of the Professions and ask to make that LMSW inactive. There's no charge to go inactive, and as long as your license is inactive and you're not using that title, you're not practicing that profession, you don't have to pay any registration fee to us, because the LCSW's scope encompasses LMSW, so they can use just that one license to provide all the services that they're competent to perform within the scope of practice.
Okay, great. Another issue is continuing education, Karen. Once you're licensed, are there requirements to complete continuing education in order to maintain your license?
There is actually no requirement in New York State for continuing education credits. We're one of the only states that doesn't actually have this. However, there's a variety of ways that you can increase your skills and capabilities through both our office and other providers that allow for continuing education courses.
And it's still, people are ethically obligated and legally obligated to practice within their scope of competence, and absolutely, that is a way to develop that. One and frequently asked question is about grandparenting. Are there any ways to get grandparented as an LMSW or an LCSW today or moving forward?
No, there was a grandparenting period between September 1st of 2004 to August 31st, 2005. That train has left the station. There are no other available options to become grandparented.
So people have to pass the exam, yes, in order to get licensed at either level. Okay. One last question. If I'm licensed as an LCSW, do I need to get the R privilege to have a private practice?
That's a good question, and the answer, like so many times, it sort of depends on the situation of the individual. Once you are licensed as a clinical social worker, if you are competent to provide psychotherapy, the law allows you to set up a practice to provide psychotherapy, to engage in diagnosis, to provide clinical social work services as those are defined in the law, without meeting any other requirements. However, and many insurance plans might reimburse an individual who has the LCSW, because in the language of the insurers, that's the independent clinical license, and that's what they tend to look for. So the R's, so an individual really doesn't need to meet any other requirements to practice psychotherapy. But however, New York insurance law and the licensing law for many years have provided what's called the R privilege. And that's an additional 3 years of post-LCSW supervised experience in doing psychotherapy and diagnosis. An individual can apply for this by submitting to the department what we call Form 1 Social Work Privilege, SWPR, and a $100 fee, along with a Form 6 SWPR, where they and their supervisor present a plan for how that LCSW is going to complete supervised experience toward that privilege. That plan should spell out that the individual is going to get supervision, individual or group supervision from the supervisor, or the individual could enroll in one of the psychotherapy institutes that are prevalent in New York, particularly in the downstate region, where they get additional education as well as the opportunity to provide services under the supervision of a qualified supervisor. When they complete those 3 years of experience, or 2,400 client clock hours, the supervisor submits verification to us, and then we can issue the R privilege, which goes as part of their license registration. It doesn't go with their license certificate or parchment, and once you receive the R, there's no requirement that you complete any additional training. It is used by some insurance companies to designate individuals who are qualified for reimbursement, because that ties to the language in the insurance law. We know that there are insurers, though, who don't require the R, and so an individual might want to check about insurance coverage or other reimbursement before they start going down the road toward the R, because it's not something that every LCSW will need as part of their license.
Okay, and just a follow-up, what is a qualified supervisor for someone working towards their R?
The qualified supervisor for someone working toward the R include a licensed psychologist, a licensed physician who is a psychiatrist, and an individual who's a licensed clinical social worker who has the R themselves. In previous years, we allowed peers to sort of supervise each other and realized that was not really, one, an effective way to get supervision, and two, was not consistent with the insurance law. So that was one of the changes made in 2010 in the regulations to clarify that an LCSW could not supervise another LCSW for the R. It has to be an LCSW with the R, the psychologist or the psychiatrist.
Okay. Well, wow, we've covered a lot of ground, but if someone still has questions about licensure and practice, where can they get more information?
As should have become obvious during our discussions, the licensing laws and regulations are very complex in New York, and individuals are invited to go to our website, www.op.nysed.gov, and there they get access to the education law. They can look up the profession of social work and find the laws, the rules, the regulations. They can find practice guidelines, recommendations for things that you should do and things that you should not do in the practice of the profession. We have implemented a software technology so that there's a Find Answers tab on our website that organizes about 1,400 questions and answers from things about licensure and practice, waivers that are available to certain corporations that want to employ social workers within a not-for-profit setting, discipline, all of that other type of information is all there for the asking on the website.
Okay, fabulous. We really feel strongly that it's critical that social work professionals and students really take the time to understand what it means to engage in licensed social work practice. We hope that we've provided you with some valuable information, and I'd like to give special thanks to my guests, Karen Moran and David Hamilton, and thank you for taking the time to join us.